Picture 5 men walking into a Persian tent. They are generals, the commanders of 10,000 Greek mercenaries stranded 1,000 miles from home. They have been invited to dinner. They will never walk out. The year is 401 BC. The place is a god-forsaken stretch of Mesopotamian desert somewhere north of Babylon. General Clearchus of Sparta, the most feared mercenary commander in the Greek world, has just received an invitation from Tissaphernes, the Persian satrap. The message is polite, diplomatic, almost friendly. Tissaphernes wants to discuss safe passage. He wants to negotiate. He promises food, wine, and the hospitality of the great king. Clearchus should know better. This is a man who has survived 20 years of warfare, who has killed more men than most soldiers have met. His instincts are screaming, but he is tired. His army is tired. They have been wandering in this burning wasteland for weeks, harassed by Persian cavalry, running low on supplies, watching their wounded die of sepsis and heat stroke. The promise of negotiation, of ending this nightmare with words instead of blood, is too tempting to resist. So Clearchus puts on his best cloak. He polishes his bronze greaves. He takes 4 other generals with him, Proxenus, Menon, Augeas, and Socrates, along with 20 captains and 200 soldiers who want to buy provisions at the Persian camp. They march toward the enemy tents like lambs walking into a slaughterhouse. The dinner starts well enough. Tissaphernes is charming, almost obsequious. He pours wine with his own hands. He speaks of peace, of friendship between Greeks and Persians, of the generous terms the great king is prepared to offer. The Greeks relax, they drink, they eat lamb and dates and soft Persian bread. For the first time in months, they allow themselves to believe that they might actually survive this. Then the signal comes. No one knows exactly what it was. A dropped cup, a shouted word, a flash of sunlight on a hidden blade. But in an instant, the tent is full of armed men. Persian soldiers pour through every entrance, swords already drawn. The 20 captains are cut down where they sit, their throats open before they can reach for weapons. The 200 Greek soldiers outside hear the screaming and try to flee, but Persian cavalry has already encircled the camp. They are ridden down and speared like pigs. Inside the tent, the 5 generals are not killed immediately. That would be too merciful. They are seized, disarmed, and bound with leather straps. Tissaphernes wants them alive, for now. He wants to parade them before the great king. He wants to demonstrate that the fearsome Greek mercenaries, the invincible hoplites who had carved through Persian armies like a hot knife through fat, can be defeated not with spears but with treachery. The generals are dragged away in chains. Days later, somewhere in the Persian heartland, they are executed. Clearchus, the Spartan butcher who once crucified his own mutinous soldiers, is beheaded like a common criminal. Proxenus, the Boeotian aristocrat who had recruited many of the 10,000 with promises of glory and gold, watches his friends die before the blade finds his own neck. Their heads are sent to the great king as trophies, and back at the Greek camp, 10,000 men wake up to discover that they are leaderless, surrounded, and 1,000 miles from the sea. This is where most stories would end. This is the moment when an army should disintegrate, when men should scatter into the desert to die alone or surrender to Persian mercy. The strategic situation is beyond hopeless. They are deep inside enemy territory, cut off from supplies, from reinforcements, from any possibility of rescue. The Persian Empire stretches around them in every direction, millions of square miles of hostile land filled with enemies who want them dead. But the 10,000 do not surrender. They do not scatter. Instead, they do something that will echo through military history for the next 2.5 millennia. They hold a meeting. That night, by the flickering light of campfires, the surviving officers gather in a circle. They are captains, lieutenants, sergeants, the middle management of a suddenly headless army. They have no supreme commander. They have no plan. They have only the grim knowledge that if they do nothing, they will all be dead within a week. A young Athenian named Xenophon stands up to speak. He is not a professional soldier. He is a philosopher, a student of Socrates, a man who joined this expedition more out of curiosity than ambition. But he has a voice that carries, and more importantly, he has an idea. We cannot wait for rescue, he tells them. Rescue is not coming. We cannot negotiate. Negotiation is a trap. We have only one option. We march. We march north, through the mountains, through the snow, through whatever the Persians throw at us. We march until we reach the sea. And anyone who tries to stop us, we kill. It is not a sophisticated plan. It is not even a particularly good plan. But it is the only plan that does not end with 10,000 Greek corpses rotting in the Mesopotamian sun. The officers vote. The motion passes, the march of the 10,000 has begun. Before we follow the Greeks into the mountains, we need to understand what kind of army we are dealing with. The 10,000 were not a ragtag band of refugees. They were not desperate peasants conscripted at spear point. They were professionals, the deadliest infantry force the ancient world had ever produced. And their survival was not a miracle, but a product of cold mechanical efficiency. Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that heroic narratives often ignore. A Greek hoplite consumes approximately 3 pounds of grain per day. His slave, and yes, most hoplites brought slaves, consumes another 2 pounds. Add water, which in the Mesopotamian desert means at least a gallon per man per day, more if they are marching. Multiply by 10,000 hoplites, 8,000 light troops, and roughly 20,000 camp followers, slaves, and women. The daily caloric requirement of this army is approximately 120,000 pounds of food and 40,000 gallons of water. This is not an army. This is a mobile city. It is a logistical nightmare wrapped in bronze armor. The Greeks who joined Cyrus the Younger's expedition understood this calculus. They were not idealists fighting for glory. They were contractors, mercenaries who sold their skills to the highest bidder. Greece in 401 BC was a land of chronic unemployment for men trained in nothing but war. The Peloponnesian War had ended 7 years earlier, leaving thousands of veterans with no enemies to fight and no money to live on. When Cyrus sent recruiters through the Greek cities, promising gold and adventure in the mysterious East, these men signed up not for patriotism but for a paycheck. The pay was good. A hoplite received 1 daric per month, a gold coin worth roughly 20 silver drachmas, enough to feed a family for weeks. Officers received more. Generals received much more. Clearchus, the Spartan commander, was paid 10,000 darics just to raise his contingent. At these rates, even a short campaign could set a man up for life. But the pay came with expectations. These were not amateur militias. They were soldiers who had trained since childhood in the brutal art of phalanx warfare. The hoplite panoply, the bronze helmet, the linen cuirass, the massive hoplon shield, the 8-foot doru spear, weighed approximately 70 pounds. A man who could not march 20 miles a day in this equipment while maintaining formation was useless. A man who broke formation in battle was worse than useless. He was a threat to everyone around him. The training was relentless. From the age of 7, Greek boys learned to fight in close formation, shield pressed against the back of the man in front, spear thrust over his shoulder. They learned to ignore the screaming, the blood, the stench of opened bowels. They learned to step forward over the bodies of their friends and keep pushing. The phalanx was not a collection of individual warriors. It was a single organism, a wall of bronze and flesh that moved with the synchronized precision of a machine. And here is what made the Greeks truly terrifying. They were better at this than anyone else in the world. The Persian Empire had conquered everything from Egypt to India, but it had never faced an army like this. Persian infantry were brave, but they were equipped for a different kind of war: light armor, wicker shields, short swords designed for skirmishing rather than grinding, face-to-face slaughter. When Greek hoplites and Persian infantry met in open battle, the result was not a contest. It was an industrial process. The Greeks would advance in formation, absorb the Persian arrows on their shields close to spear range, and then simply grind forward, stabbing and pushing until there was nothing left to stab. At the Battle of Cunaxa, where Cyrus the Younger made his bid for the Persian throne, the Greek mercenaries demonstrated this superiority in the most dramatic way possible. They were stationed on the right wing of Cyrus's army, facing a Persian force that outnumbered them 10-1. When the signal came to advance, they did not charge in a screaming mob. They walked forward in perfect formation, singing the paean, their spears leveled like the quills of a giant porcupine. The Persians facing them did something remarkable. They ran. Before the Greeks even reached them, the entire Persian left wing dissolved into a panicked rout. The imperial soldiers threw down their weapons and fled, trampling each other in their desperation to escape the bronze wall advancing toward them. The Greeks pursued for miles, killing stragglers, looting the dead, barely breaking a sweat. They won their part of the battle without losing a single man. But here is the cruel irony of Cunaxa. The Greeks won, and it did not matter. While they were chasing routers across the desert, Cyrus was leading a cavalry charge against his brother Artaxerxes in the center of the field. Cyrus found the great king. He wounded him. For one glorious moment, it looked like the rebellion would succeed. Then a javelin caught Cyrus in the face, and he fell dead from his horse. By the time the Greeks finished their pursuit and returned to the main battlefield, they discovered that they had won a victory in a lost cause. Their employer was dead, his army was scattered, and they were standing in the middle of the Persian Empire with no way home. The machine had worked perfectly. It had simply been pointed at the wrong target. The first test came not from Persian swords, but from Persian geography. After the disaster of the general's murder, after the midnight councils and the desperate reorganization, the 10,000 began their march north. Their destination was the Black Sea, roughly 1,000 miles away through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. They had no maps, they had no guides, at least none they could trust. They had only the vague knowledge that the sea lay somewhere beyond the mountains, and that if they kept walking long enough, they would either reach it or die. The route Xenophon chose led first through the flatlands of Mesopotamia, then up into the highlands of Armenia, and finally across the snow-capped ranges that separated the Persian interior from the coastal plains of the Euxine. It was a journey that would take 5 months and cost thousands of lives. But before they could reach the mountains, they had to survive the desert. The Mesopotamian plain in autumn is a landscape designed by a malevolent god. The heat during the day reaches temperatures that can kill an unprotected man in hours. The nights drop to near freezing, leaving soldiers shivering in cloaks still damp with the day's sweat. Water sources are scarce and unpredictable. A well that was full yesterday may be dry or poisoned today. The sand gets into everything: food, wounds, eyes, lungs. For the first 3 days of the march, the Persians did not attack. They did not need to. They simply followed at a distance, watching, waiting for the desert to do their work for them. Persian cavalry shadowed the Greek column, riding along the ridge lines, appearing and disappearing like mirages. They did not engage, they just watched. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers who had faced death in 100 battles found themselves jumping at shadows, starting at every distant dust cloud. Was that a scouting party? An ambush? The main Persian army coming to finish them off? The not knowing was worse than fighting. At least in battle you could see your enemy. Here the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. On the 4th day the Persians made their move. It was not a frontal assault. Tissaphernes was too smart for that. Instead, the Persian cavalry began a systematic campaign of harassment designed to bleed the Greeks dry without ever meeting them in open combat. The attacks came at the worst possible moments, during river crossings, when half the army was on one bank and half on the other, during the chaos of making camp, when men were scattered and vulnerable, during the pre-dawn hours when exhausted sentries struggled to stay awake. Persian archers would ride close, loose a volley of arrows into the packed Greek formation, and then gallop away before the hoplites could respond. They targeted officers, supply animals, anyone who looked important. They never stayed to fight. They just killed and ran. The Greeks had no effective counter to these tactics. Their strength was in the phalanx, in close-quarters combat where their heavy armor and long spears made them invincible. But you cannot phalanx a horse archer who refuses to stand still. The hoplites would form up, lower their spears, and advance, and the Persians would simply ride away laughing, only to return an hour later from a different direction. The casualties mounted. 10 men the first day, 20 the second, 50 the third. None of them died gloriously in combat. They died with Persian arrows in their backs, or their groins, or their unprotected faces. They died screaming for water that no one could bring them. They died in the arms of friends who could do nothing but watch and wait for their own turn. Xenophon, watching this slaughter, understood that they needed cavalry of their own. The problem was that Greeks did not ride. Horses were expensive, difficult to maintain, and useless in phalanx warfare. A Greek gentleman might own a horse for racing or hunting, but the idea of fighting from horseback was almost unknown. So Xenophon improvised. He ordered the officers to hand over their personal horses, the few dozen mounts that had survived the campaign, and organized them into a makeshift cavalry force. It was a pathetic squadron, perhaps 50 riders in all, most of them barely competent horsemen. But it was something. When the Persian archers appeared, the Greek cavalry could now pursue them, forcing them to flee rather than pick off targets at leisure. More importantly, Xenophon reorganized the army's march formation. Instead of one long column, he split the 10,000 into a hollow square, hoplites on the outside, supplies and wounded in the center. When attacked from the rear guard could form a defensive line while the rest of the army kept moving. When attacked from the flank, the entire square could pivot to face the threat. It was slower, more exhausting, and required constant coordination, but it reduced casualties dramatically. The Persians adjusted. They began attacking the supply train, targeting the pack animals that carried food and water. A dead mule could not be eaten. By the time soldiers butchered it, the meat would already be rotting in the heat, but a dead mule meant that much less food for the march ahead. The Greeks responded by positioning light troops to guard the baggage, but this stretched their formation thin and created new vulnerabilities. It was a grinding, attritional nightmare. Every day brought new deaths, new hardships, new impossible decisions. Abandon the wounded to the Persians or slow the march to carry them. Ration the water strictly and watch men collapse from dehydration, or distribute it freely and run out before the next source. There were no good options. There were only degrees of disaster. By the time the Greeks reached the foothills of the Armenian highlands, they had been marching for 3 weeks. They had lost perhaps 1,000 men to Persian harassment, disease, and exhaustion. They were dehydrated, malnourished, and running dangerously low on supplies, but they were still alive. And ahead of them, rising like a wall against the sky, were the mountains. The desert had been a slow death. The mountains would be something else entirely. The Carducci were not Persians. This was the first and most important thing to understand about them. They were mountain people, fiercely independent tribes who had lived in these highlands since before anyone could remember. The Persian Empire claimed their territory on maps, but the great king's tax collectors rarely ventured into Carduchian valleys. Those who did rarely came back. When the 10,000 entered Carduchian territory, they were hoping for respite. The Persian cavalry that had harassed them through the desert could not follow into the mountains. Horses were useless on steep, rocky trails. Tissaphernes and his riders fell back, presumably planning to catch the Greeks when they emerged on the other side. For the first time in weeks, the mercenaries marched without arrows whistling around their heads. They should have been relieved. Instead, they found something worse. The Carducci did not fight like Persians. They did not form battle lines or send heralds to negotiate. They simply killed anyone who entered their territory, and they had perfected the art of mountain warfare over centuries of practice. The attacks began on the first night. Greek sentries heard nothing. No war cries, no trumpet signals, no trampling of boots, just the whisper of moving shadows, and then men dying with their throats cut. By morning, 24 soldiers were dead, killed in their sleep by enemies they never saw. Xenophon doubled the guard. It did not help. The Carducci knew every rock, every ravine, every hidden path through their mountains. They could approach within feet of a Greek campfire and disappear before anyone noticed. They killed with knives and clubs silently, efficiently, and they took the weapons and armor from the bodies before vanishing back into the darkness. The daytime marches were worse. The trail through the Carduchian highlands was barely a goat path, winding along cliff edges and through narrow defiles. The Greeks had to march in single file, their famous phalanx formation completely useless. And from the heights above, the Carducci rained death. Their primary weapon was the boulder. Carduchian warriors would position themselves on cliff tops overlooking the trail, wait until the Greek column was strung out beneath them, and then push massive stones over the edge. The effect was catastrophic. A boulder weighing half a ton rolling down a steep slope did not care about bronze armor. It crushed men like insects, shattering shields and helmets, turning soldiers into unrecognizable pulp. The Greeks could not fight back. They could not climb the cliffs while being pelted with rocks. They could not retreat. The way back was even more dangerous than the way forward. They could only advance through the gauntlet, watching their friends die, knowing that at any moment a shadow on the cliff above might be the last thing they ever saw. The army's discipline began to crack. Men who had marched unflinching through Persian arrows started to panic at every falling pebble. Officers who had commanded with calm authority began screaming contradictory orders. The fear was contagious, spreading through the column like a plague. Xenophon responded with tactical innovation and brutal necessity. He organized small squads of peltasts, light troops armed with javelins, and sent them scrambling up the slopes ahead of the main column. Their job was not to defeat the Carducci, but to force them to retreat, to create a brief window of safety for the hoplites below. It was suicide work. Many of the peltasts never came back. For those who died, there was no proper burial. The Greeks could not stop to dig graves while boulders crashed around them. They could not carry the bodies. The trails were too narrow. The living needed their strength. The dead were stripped of usable equipment and left where they fell, food for whatever scavengers lived in these cursed mountains. The march through Carduchian territory took 7 days. 7 days of constant terror, constant death, constant movement through terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent intelligence. The Greeks lost more men in that week than in all the Persian harassment combined, perhaps 2,000 dead, though no one had time to keep accurate counts. But the mechanical discipline that had been beaten into these men since childhood held firm. They did not scatter. They did not surrender. When Carducci appeared, they formed what defenses they could. When the trail was clear, they marched. When comrades fell, they stepped over the bodies and kept going. On the 8th day, the terrain began to change. The cliffs grew less steep, the trails widened, and ahead, spread out below them like a vast white blanket, were the plains of Armenia. The Greeks had survived the Carduchian gauntlet, but the price had been terrible, and the worst was yet to come. The Armenian winter was waiting, and the snow-covered highlands cared nothing for Greek discipline or Persian treachery. Winter would kill with patient, indifferent cruelty. The dead Carducci left behind on the trail at least had the mercy of dying quickly. The Greeks marching down into the Armenian snows would not be so fortunate. The first snow fell on the 3rd day in Armenia. Light flurries at first, almost pretty. The Greek soldiers, most of whom had never seen mountains in winter, stopped to catch snowflakes on their tongues like children. By evening, the flurries had become a blizzard. By the next morning, the army was fighting for its life. The temperature in the Armenian highlands during winter can drop to 20 degrees below freezing. This is not merely uncomfortable. This is a killing cold, the kind that turns exposed flesh to dead meat in minutes. The Greeks were equipped for Mediterranean warfare: linen tunics, woolen cloaks, sandals. They had no fur-lined boots, no leather gloves, no shelter beyond what they could improvise from captured materials. The casualties began almost immediately, but they were not the casualties of battle. Men simply sat down in the snow to rest and did not get up again. Their friends would shake them, slap them, scream at them, and the men would stare back with eyes that had already begun to glaze. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, then hands and feet, then whole limbs. Soldiers who seemed healthy at dawn would be dead by noon, their bodies frozen into grotesque statues half buried in drifts. The army's physicians, such as they were, had no treatment for cold injury. They did not understand the mechanism of frostbite, did not know that the blackened flesh needed amputation or the rot would spread. Men walked on feet that had already died, feeling nothing, not understanding why their legs would not obey commands. When the flesh finally fell away, exposing raw bone, they died of shock or infection. Xenophon ordered the army to keep moving. It was the only choice. To stop was to die. But movement became increasingly difficult as the snow deepened. In the mountain passes, drifts reached depths of 6 feet, sometimes more. Men had to wade through chest-high snow, expending enormous energy just to advance a few hundred yards. The army's pace slowed to a crawl. Food became critically scarce. The supply animals had been dying throughout the march, some to Carduchian attacks, some some to exhaustion, some to the cold itself. The remaining provisions were divided into ever smaller portions. Soldiers who had once eaten 3 pounds of grain per day now survived on a handful of barley and whatever roots they could dig from the frozen ground. Then the locals turned hostile. The Armenians were not warriors like the Carducci. They were farmers and herders, people who wanted only to be left alone. But the arrival of 10,000 starving soldiers meant the destruction of everything they had worked to build. The Greeks needed food. The Armenians had food. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Xenophon tried to negotiate. He sent envoys to Armenian villages offering to pay for supplies, promising that the army would pass through peacefully if given provisions. Some villages agreed. Others refused. And for those who refused, the Greeks did what armies have done since the beginning of time. They took what they needed. The foraging parties went out in force, several hundred men at a time, enough to overwhelm any resistance. They descended on Armenian settlements like locusts, stripping granaries, slaughtering livestock, carrying away everything edible. The villagers who resisted were killed. Those who fled were sometimes hunted down, their hidden stores discovered and plundered. This was not heroic. This was not glorious. This was survival at its most primal, strong men taking from weak men because the alternative was death. The Greeks who wrote later about this march preferred to gloss over these episodes, emphasizing instead the cleverness of their tactical innovations and the courage of their combat against armed enemies. But the truth is that much of the 10,000 survival came at the cost of Armenian civilians who had done nothing wrong except live in the path of a desperate army. The army found temporary shelter in Armenian villages, mud brick houses built half underground to conserve heat. These dwellings were a revelation to men who had been sleeping in snowdrifts. They were warm, dry, and stocked with food the villagers had been storing for winter. The Greeks stayed for days, sometimes weeks, resting, eating, treating their frostbite as best they could. In the village stores, they discovered something extraordinary: wine. The Armenians brewed a barley beer that they stored in clay jars buried in the earth, kept at constant temperature by the frozen soil. The Greeks, who had not tasted alcohol in months, fell upon this discovery with desperate enthusiasm. Men who had maintained iron discipline through Persian ambushes and Carduchian attacks lost all restraint in the presence of beer. Xenophon watched with concern as his army got drunk. He understood the psychological need. These men had been through hell, and a few days of warmth and intoxication might be what they needed to keep going. But he also understood the danger. Every day they lingered was another day for the Persians to organize a response, another day for winter to deepen, another day closer to running out of stolen food. He gave the order to march. Some men obeyed. Others had to be dragged from the warmth of the underground houses, sobbing, begging, cursing their commanders. A few refused entirely and were left behind to whatever fate awaited them. The army pushed on through the Armenian highlands, marching by day, sheltering where they could at night. The snow continued to fall. The cold continued to kill. And somewhere ahead, invisible beyond the white curtain of endless winter, the sea was waiting. We must pause here to examine what this march was doing to the men who survived it. The human body is remarkably adaptable. It can function on insufficient food, inadequate sleep, and constant physical stress for far longer than most people assume. But there are costs. The body begins to consume itself, first the fat reserves, then the muscle tissue, then the organs themselves. Men who had been robust soldiers at the start of the campaign were now skeletal figures, their eyes too large for their shrunken faces, their joints protruding through papery skin. The mind adapts as well, but its adaptations are darker. Soldiers who had been horrified by their first kill in combat now butchered enemies with mechanical indifference. Compassion, which requires energy to maintain, was one of the first casualties. Men learned to step over dying comrades without pausing, to eat while surrounded by corpses, to sleep while friends screamed nearby. They did not become monsters, they became efficient. The army that descended from the Armenian highlands was not the same army that had entered them. The weak had been culled by Persian arrows, by Carduchian boulders, by cold and starvation and disease. What remained was a core of survivors, men who had proven themselves capable of enduring anything. They were harder now, meaner, stripped of everything that made civilized society possible. Xenophon noted this transformation with something between admiration and unease. He needed these hard men to survive, but he also recognized that an army of brutalized survivors might pose a different kind of threat when they finally reached Greek territory. Men who had learned to take what they needed by force did not easily unlearn that lesson. The march continued through the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey. The terrain was easier than the mountains behind them, rolling hills rather than sheer cliffs, forests where fuel could be found, rivers that had not yet frozen solid. But the Persians had not forgotten them. Tissaphernes was waiting. The Persian general had not pursued the Greeks through the mountains. His cavalry was useless in that terrain, and the Carduchi would have been just as hostile to Persian soldiers as to Greek ones. Instead, he had taken the lowland route, circling around the highlands to position his army between the Greeks and the sea. When the 10,000 emerged from the mountains, they found a Persian force blocking their path. But these were not the same Greeks who had panicked under cavalry harassment in the desert. These men had survived hell. They had killed and stolen and watched friends freeze to death. They had nothing left to fear. The battle, when it came, was not a contest. The Greeks formed their phalanx, lowered their spears, and advanced with the steady patience of men who knew they were going to win. The Persian infantry, facing the same bronze wall that had shattered their comrades at Cunaxa, broke before contact. They ran, and the Greeks pursued, cutting down hundreds of fleeing soldiers. Tissaphernes withdrew. He would shadow the army for a while longer, looking for opportunities, but he had learned an important lesson. The 10,000 could not be defeated by conventional means. They were too disciplined, too desperate, too willing to accept any cost in pursuit of survival. The Greeks pressed on toward the coast. The terrain changed again as they entered the region around Trebizond, modern Trabzon in Turkey. The hills gave way to forested valleys, then to steep gorges carved by rivers rushing toward the sea. They were close now, perhaps only days from their destination. But the local tribes had other ideas. The Colchians were another mountain people, as hostile as the Carducci but with different tactics. Rather than attacking from above, they preferred ambushes at river crossings, waiting until half the Greek army was on one bank before attacking the other half. They used poisoned arrows, coating their points with a substance that caused convulsions and death even from superficial wounds. They set fire to forests the Greeks were marching through, trying to trap them in walls of flame. Each obstacle was overcome through the same grim calculus that had carried the army this far. Sacrifice some to save many, accept losses in order to advance, never stop moving because to stop was to die. The nights grew warmer, the snow gave way to rain. The air began to carry a smell that some of the older soldiers recognized from their youth in coastal cities, the smell of salt, of seaweed, of something vast and limitless waiting just beyond the horizon. They were almost there. On the morning of the 5th month since leaving Cunaxa, the vanguard of the Greek army crested a ridge called Mount Thetches and stopped. Below them, glittering in the pale winter sunlight, was the Black Sea. The reaction was not immediate. For a long moment, the soldiers simply stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Some thought it was another mountain lake, like dozens they had passed in the highlands. Others thought it was a mirage, a cruel trick of exhaustion and wishful thinking. But then the wind shifted, carrying the unmistakable smell of salt water, and the reality hit them like a physical blow. The first scream came from the front of the column. "Thalata! Thalata! The sea! The sea!" The cry spread backward through the army like wildfire. Men who had been trudging in exhausted silence suddenly found voices they had not used in weeks. They shouted, they wept, they embraced strangers who had become closer than brothers through shared suffering. The column dissolved into chaos as soldiers pushed forward, desperate to see for themselves, to confirm that this was real, that they had actually done it. Xenophon, watching from his position near the rear, felt tears streaming down his own face. He was not a man given to emotional displays, but this moment broke through every defense. They had walked 1,000 miles through fire and snow and death. They had been betrayed, hunted, frozen, starved. They had lost perhaps 4,000 of their number. No one knew the exact count anymore. And now, against all probability, they were looking at the sea. The sea meant civilization. It meant Greek cities along the coast, places where they could find food and shelter and ships. It meant an end to the nightmare, a return to the world of laws and commerce and basic human dignity. It meant they might actually see their homes again. The army made camp on the ridge that night, unwilling to leave the sight of the water. They built enormous fires from the scrubby trees that grew on the slopes, partly for warmth but mainly for celebration. There was singing, there was drinking of whatever fermented substances they had acquired in the last villages. There was storytelling and boasting and the kind of dark humor that only soldiers understand. But the celebration was not universal. In the quiet spaces between the fires, men wept for different reasons. They wept for the friends who had not made it, whose bodies lay scattered across 1,000 miles of hostile territory. They wept for the things they had done to survive, the stolen food, the killed villagers, the abandoned wounded. They wept for the people they had been before this march began, people who seemed like strangers now. The army descended from Mount Thetches the next day, making for the Greek colony of Trebizond on the coast. It should have been a triumphant arrival. Instead, it was awkward and tense. The Greeks of Trebizond were not particularly pleased to see 10,000 armed men appear at their gates. Yes, they were fellow Greeks. Yes, they had just accomplished something remarkable. But they were also dangerous, a disciplined military force that had spent months taking what it needed by force. The Trebizondians welcomed them cautiously, providing food and shelter but keeping their own militias on alert. The 10,000 stayed in Trebizond for 30 days, resting, healing, and trying to figure out what to do next. Some men wanted to sail home immediately, to return to their cities and their families and put this nightmare behind them. Others, surprisingly, wanted to stay. They had become addicted to the camaraderie of the march, the clarity of purpose that came from simple survival. The idea of returning to peacetime life, with all its ambiguities and petty concerns, seemed unbearable. A few proposed something more radical. Why not conquer this territory for themselves? They were a battle-hardened army with no employers and no obligations. The cities along the Black Sea coast were wealthy but poorly defended. Why not carve out a kingdom of their own, ruled by soldiers who had proven their worth in the ultimate test? Xenophon flirted with this idea. He consulted oracles seeking divine guidance about whether he should lead a colonization effort. The gods, as usual, were ambiguous, but ultimately he decided against it. The 10,000 were survivors, not conquerors. They had come too far to become the thing they had been fighting against. The army eventually split up. Some groups sailed east, hiring themselves out to other conflicts in Asia Minor. Others sailed west, toward the Greek mainland. Some settled in the colonies along the coast, finding wives and building new lives far from the homes they had left years ago. And a few, a stubborn core of veterans who could not stop fighting, eventually made their way back to Greece just in time for the next war. But the story of the 10,000 did not end with their dispersal. It had only begun. What the 10,000 accomplished was more than a feat of survival. It was a strategic revelation that would reshape the ancient world. Consider what they had proven. A relatively small force of Greek heavy infantry, operating without supply lines, without cavalry superiority, without any of the traditional advantages that empires used to crush smaller opponents, had marched through the heart of the Persian Empire and emerged intact. They had defeated every army sent against them. They had survived every natural obstacle. They had demonstrated conclusively that the Persian colossus had feet of clay. The Persian Empire was the superpower of its age. It stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, incorporating dozens of peoples and languages commanded by the absolute authority of the great king. For 2 centuries, it had dominated the Near East, crushing rebellions, absorbing smaller states, projecting power across distances that seemed impossible to pre-modern logistics. Greece was a collection of squabbling city-states on the empire's western fringe, important for its silver and its troublesome mercenaries, but hardly a serious threat to Persian supremacy. The March of the 10,000 changed that calculation forever. Xenophon wrote an account of the expedition called the Anabasis, which translates roughly as the march up country. It became one of the influential military texts in ancient history, studied by commanders for centuries afterward. But its importance lay not in its tactical details. Those were specific to circumstances that would never be repeated exactly. Its importance lay in its central message: Persia can be beaten. A young Macedonian prince named Philip read the Anabasis and took notes. His son Alexander practically memorized it. When Alexander launched his invasion of the Persian Empire in 334 BC, he was following a path that the 10,000 had blazed 70 years earlier. He knew that Greek heavy infantry could defeat Persian forces in the field. He knew that Persian logistics were vulnerable to fast-moving strike forces. He knew that the empire's vast size, which seemed like a strength, was actually a weakness. There was too much territory to defend everywhere. Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire in a decade, creating the largest domain the Western world had ever seen. He did it with an army that was in many ways simply a larger, better organized version of the 10,000. The foundation of his success was laid in the blood and snow of the Armenian highlands, but the lessons of the Anabasis extended beyond military strategy. The 10,000 had also demonstrated something about the Greek character that would echo through Western civilization for millennia. They had governed themselves. When their generals were murdered, the 10,000 did not descend into chaos or submit to a strongman. They held assemblies, they voted, they elected new commanders and held them accountable for their decisions. Even in the extremity of their circumstances, starving, freezing, surrounded by enemies, they maintained the democratic practices that defined Greek political culture. This was not inevitable. Most armies throughout history have been authoritarian structures, ruled by kings or generals who demanded obedience without question. The 10,000 could have chosen that path. They could have handed absolute power to Xenophon or one of the other surviving officers and hoped for the best. Instead, they insisted on participation, on debate, on the right of every soldier to have a voice in the decisions that affected his life. Was their democracy perfect? Of course not. It was messy, contentious, often paralyzed by factional disputes. Important decisions were sometimes delayed while the army argued about procedure, but it worked. It carried them through situations that would have destroyed a less cohesive force, and it demonstrated that self-governance was possible even under the most extreme circumstances. This idea that free men governing themselves can accomplish things that slaves and subjects cannot became one of the founding myths of Western political thought. It would be invoked by Roman republicans resisting tyranny, by Renaissance city-states defending their independence, by Enlightenment philosophers arguing for a constitutional government, by American revolutionaries declaring their right to self-determination. The 10,000 did not know they were making history. They were just trying to survive. But the survival mechanisms they chose, the political forms they insisted on maintaining even as they starved and froze, would shape the world for the next 2,500 years. They marched through hell and came out the other side carrying democracy on their backs. Not all of them made it home. Of the approximately 13,000 Greeks who marched with Cyrus into the heart of Persia, perhaps 6,000 eventually returned to their native cities. The rest, 7,000 men, died along the way, their bodies scattered across 1,000 miles of foreign soil. We know almost none of their names. History remembers Xenophon, who survived to write the Anabasis and lived to a prosperous old age as a gentleman farmer in the Peloponnese. It remembers Clearchus and the other generals who died in Persian chains. It remembers a few of the more colorful characters, the stubborn Spartan Amompharetus, who delayed the retreat at Plataea, the handsome Calliades, who died before he could strike a blow. But the vast majority of the 10,000 vanished into anonymity, their stories lost with them. Consider what we do not know. We do not know the name of the soldier who first spotted the sea from Mount Thetches. We do not know who led the desperate charge that finally broke through the Colchian ambush. We do not know who carried the wounded through the Armenian snows, or who stayed behind with dying friends when the army could not wait, or who performed the countless small acts of courage and sacrifice that made survival possible. These men existed. They had families, histories, hopes for the future that would never be realized. They left homes in Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and a dozen other cities, expecting to return with gold and glory. Instead, they became footnotes, their names forgotten before their bones had finished bleaching in the sun. This is the reality of military history that heroic narratives prefer to ignore. The stories we tell focus on generals and kings, on decisive battles and dramatic turning points. But the actual work of warfare, the marching, the fighting, the dying, is done by ordinary men whose individuality is erased by the scale of events. The survivors who returned to Greece carried this knowledge with them. They knew that their fame was borrowed, that they would be celebrated as members of the 10,000 rather than as individual human beings. Some found this comforting. The anonymity of the collective was a kind of protection, a shared identity that transcended personal inadequacy. Others found it maddening, knowing that their particular sufferings, their specific acts of courage, would be averaged into a general story that belonged to no one. What did they do with the rest of their lives? Some resumed their previous occupations, returning to farms or trades they had left years before, but they found that peacetime life had become alien to them. The concerns of civilians, crop yields, commercial disputes, village gossip, seemed trivial after what they had experienced. They had trouble sleeping. They startled at sudden noises. They felt most alive when they were in danger and most dead when they were safe. Others could not stop fighting. The Greek world in the early 4th century BC was full of conflicts. Wars between city-states, civil strife within cities, colonial ventures that needed military muscle. Veterans of the 10,000 were in high demand. They had proven their skills in the ultimate test, and employers paid premium wages for their services. These professional soldiers became a new class in Greek society, men who had no home except the army, no loyalty except to their comrades, no purpose except the next campaign. They were rootless, dangerous, and indispensable. Greek city-states that had once relied on citizen militias increasingly turned to mercenary professionals, men who fought not for patriotism but for pay. The long-term consequences of this shift were profound. As professional soldiers replaced citizen soldiers, the political culture that had produced Athenian democracy and Spartan discipline began to erode. Why should a city's citizens vote on war and peace when they would not be the ones doing the fighting? Why should soldiers care about constitutional niceties when their only interest was collecting their wages? The 10,000 did not intend to undermine Greek political institutions. They were just men trying to survive and then trying to find a place in a world that had moved on without them. But their success as a mercenary force encouraged imitation. Within a generation, professional armies had become the norm throughout the Greek world. Philip of Macedon, watching from the north, took note. He built an army of professionals, trained them to a higher standard than any citizen militia could match, and used them to conquer all of Greece. His son Alexander took that army east, following the path of the 10,000, and brought Greek civilization to the doorstep of India. The veterans of the Anabasis, those who lived long enough, watched all of this unfold. They saw their achievement absorbed into a larger story, their march overshadowed by Alexander's conquests, their survival reduced to a prelude for someone else's glory. But they knew the truth. They had been there first. Xenophon died around 354 BC, almost 50 years after the march. He spent his final decades in comfortable retirement, writing books about horses and hunting and the proper education of young men. He was respected, influential, and wealthy. He had survived. But the question that haunted his later writings, the question he could never quite answer, was whether survival was enough. The Anabasis is not a triumphant narrative. Read carefully, it is a document of trauma, a detailed record of suffering that the author returned to again and again, trying to make sense of what he had experienced. Xenophon describes the deaths of friends with clinical precision, but beneath the stoic surface there is grief that never fully heals. He catalogues the army's crimes, the looted villages, the killed civilians, the abandoned wounded, with an honesty that must have troubled his readers. He was not trying to make himself look good. He was trying to understand. The 10,000 survived. But what did they carry out of that survival? There is a passage near the end of the Anabasis where Xenophon describes the army's reaction to finally reaching safety. He expected celebration, relief, perhaps a sense of accomplishment. Instead, he found something closer to despair. Men who had been held together by shared danger fell apart when the danger ended. Old resentments surfaced. Friendships forged in crisis dissolved into petty disputes about loot and precedence. The army that had functioned as a single organism in the wilderness became a squabbling mob once it no longer needed to be anything else. Xenophon understood that what had bound them together was not virtue but necessity. They had been good to each other because their survival depended on it. Remove the necessity, and the goodness evaporated. This was not a flattering insight into human nature, but it was an honest one. Modern psychology has a term for what the 10,000 experienced: moral injury. It refers to the psychological damage caused not by what is done to you, but by what you are forced to do, the violations of your own ethical code that survival sometimes requires. The Greeks who returned from the Anabasis had stolen food from starving villagers, left wounded friends to die alone, killed men who were only defending their homes. They had done these things because the alternative was death, and because everyone around them was doing the same. But the necessity did not make the actions less corrosive. We do not have detailed records of what happened to most of the veterans. We do not know how many turned to drink, how many struggled with anger they could not control, how many found themselves unable to connect with families who had not shared their experiences. But we can guess. The patterns of post-war trauma are remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. The men who marched with Xenophon likely suffered in ways that would be familiar to veterans of any war. The story of the 10,000 is often told as an adventure, a tale of courage and endurance with a happy ending. But the truth is more complicated. It is a story about what people are capable of when stripped of civilization's protections, and about the price they pay for discovering that capability. The Greeks who set out with Cyrus were mercenaries, men who killed for money, but they were also products of a culture that valued honor, loyalty, and democratic participation. The march forced them to discover how much of that culture they were willing to abandon when their lives were at stake. Most of them abandoned more than they expected, and those who survived had to live with that knowledge. Xenophon himself seems to have achieved a kind of peace in his final years. His later writings are calmer, less haunted, more focused on practical wisdom than on the darkness of the past. Perhaps time healed some of the wounds. Perhaps the comfortable life of a retired gentleman provided enough distance from the starving, freezing soldier he had once been. Or perhaps he simply learned to live with what could not be healed. The 10,000 are remembered as heroes, but they were also victims, perpetrators, and survivors of something that should never have been survived. That is the weight they carried out of the wilderness, heavier than any bronze shield, lasting longer than any glory. It is the weight of being human in an inhuman world, and it is the true inheritance they left to history.